The Train by Jodie Barnaby. Ashley was smaller than her sister, but old enough to walk herself to school every morning and back again when the bell rang at the end of the day. She took her time when she walked, kicking the dirt to uncover rocks and pieces of colored glass, which she kept on the windowsill in her bedroom. The sun was exceptionally bright this afternoon, and Ashley had to keep a hand over her eyes to see the road. A car sped by beside her, billowing up a cloud of dirt. It stung her eyes, and she stopped to wipe them. She shielded her eyes again and followed the tires up the dirt road to where the old train station used to stand. A small figure stood by the tracks, half hidden by the tall grass. Ashley recognized the way the figure leaned against his cane. Ashley smiled and broke into a run up the dirt road. The beads in her backpack jingled in the glass jar they filled, and her school books bounced heavy against her lower back. "Uncle!" she shouted. "Uncle!" Ashley's uncle turned around to greet her with a smile. "Hello, Deuce," he said, extending his good arm to give her a hug. She rushed into him, burying her face into his wool jacket. He was warm against her cheek. She inhaled deeply. He smelled like sage. She pulled away and looked up at him. "Uncle, what are you doing here?" Ashley's uncle looked at her and grinned. His eyes crinkled in the corners, and one side of his mouth turned up into a lopsided smile, but she could see the light in his eyes. He focused his gaze down the train tracks. It was old and broken. The planks of wood between the metal rails were in pieces, and poking out of the ground from years and years of weather damage. The community no longer thought of this place, and it was apparent by the state it was in. "I'm waiting for the train," he let out in a small voice. Ashley followed his eyes down the track. It was worn and overgrown with weeds, not quite fit for a train anymore. She giggled. "Uncle, there's no train here anymore." Her uncle returned his gaze to her face and chuckled along with her. "I know, Deuce." He shifted his weight onto his cane. His smile dropped slowly. "I know." Ashley stopped smiling as well, and furrowed her brow in concern. "What's wrong? Why are you so sad?" A look of indecision crossed his face as he glanced down at his small niece. "Come here," he said as he hobbled over to a piece of concrete, foundation left from the old train station. He sat down and balanced his cane atop his knee. Ashley followed, sitting in the tall grass by his feet. She plucked a dandelion from the earth and rubbed it against the back of her hand, tracing a heart with the yellow stain. "I'm sad because our people have forgotten about this place," her uncle said, looking off down the track. Ashley started to turn her head to see what he was looking at, but stopped herself. She knew nothing was there. She had walked by this place at least 1,000 times. She focused on her uncle, tracing the lines on his small face with her eyes. Wisps of gray hair fluttered into his face as the wind blew in from behind him, but he looked so young to her right now. "What happened?" she wondered aloud. "This place is very important to me, and to people like me," he said proudly. "Why?" she asked. She didn't understand what was so important about a weeded-over train track. Her uncle clutched his cane in both hands and planted the rubber sole firmly on the ground. He leaned into it, looking down to where she sat in the tall grass. "A long time ago, there was a train that ran through this place," he began, not breaking his gaze. "It would come maybe once a month to drop things off, like rice and potatoes, stuff from outside of the reserve." He paused and took out his handkerchief from his pocket and placed it on his lap, picking at the loose threads as he spoke. "Giju would send me and your grandfather Timmy down to meet the train, because we were the oldest. We would all line up here and wait with our baskets. And then when we got our rations, we would walk home. Timmy and I would always sneak a potato each to eat on the way back. We ate them raw, like they were apples." Ashley giggled at the thought of her grandfather Timmy and her uncle as small boys eating raw potatoes. Her uncle smiled at her for a second, then narrowed his lips and continued. "One day, Giju sent the 4 oldest up with baskets. It was early fall, but she made us take our winter coats. She was crying, but we didn't know why. Giju didn't cry a lot, but when she did, she couldn't stop. She gave us each a kiss and sent us to the train." He stopped and looked down at the foundation he was sitting on. There used to be a station here." He motioned wide with his good arm. "When we got here, there were children from all over the village. I saw my cousin Benny, so I asked him what was going on. He said he didn't know." He pointed to the broken track. The train was already here, and a few men were standing by the open cargo doors. They started pointing at us and said, "Okay, you first." And then they started to put us on the train. Ashley shifted in her spot. She started to speak, but her uncle's expression stopped her. He began again. "My brother and sisters were younger than me, so they got put on a different cart. I was bigger, so they moved me to the front. When we got to the school, the nuns told us to get inside. They took our clothes, they took our baskets, they cut off all our hair. They told us we were no longer native, and if we put up a fuss, we were hit, sometimes worse." His voice trailed off into a whisper when he said this. "We weren't allowed to speak our language. We weren't allowed to be Ilnu." Ashley's uncle picked up his handkerchief and blew his nose. He clutched it tightly in his right hand. His shoulders trembled softly. "I was there for 6 years." He looked down at his niece. "I didn't know how to speak any English, so I didn't talk to many people. I was like a little mouse hiding in my room." He smiled softly, tears gathering in the corners of his mouth. "I tried to be invisible, but they find you." Ashley stared down at the grass. She plucked a few pieces and tied them into knots. "Why did they do that?" She looked up. Her uncle's face had softened. The deep lines in his face were smoother, and his eyes were bright as the sun shone down on his brown face. "Because we were different," he said calmly. Ashley could feel her cheeks growing warmer. She felt angry and confused. "Why didn't your mommy and daddy come and get you? Why didn't they stop the train?" She felt her own tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. Her uncle shrugged. "They didn't know. No one knew. But that train changed everything." "Were you sad to leave?" Ashley asked. He nodded, and his voice began to tremble again. "There was nobody beside us waving us goodbye. There was nobody there to hug us and to kiss us, and to remember what we were when we left that day." "I'm sorry, Uncle," Ashley choked through her tears. He extended his good arm and placed a hand on her shaking shoulder. "It's not your fault, Deuce." He lifted her chin and smiled down at her. "You and your sister make me so happy when I hear you laugh, and I see you run and play. It makes me so happy. It makes me think one day everything will be okay again. One day we won't be so sad." He paused and looked down back towards the track for a moment. "I wanted you to know where your family has come from, Ashley, so you can be proud of where you are going." Ashley wiped her tears with the sleeve of her shirt and nodded her head. "Is that why you come sit here, Uncle? To remember what happened?" He nodded his head and sat reflectively for a moment. "I come here to remember what happened, but I also come here to wait." "What are you waiting for?" she asked, craning her neck around to look at the tracks. They sat still in the evening light, broken and rusted, covered in brush, just how she had left them. "I'm waiting for what we lost that day to come back to us," he said after a moment. "Why?" she asked. "Because if I don't, who will?" he said, closing his eyes tightly. Ashley reached up and grabbed her uncle's hand. It sat small inside his. He opened his eyes again and looked down at his small niece. She smiled up at him and said, "Don't worry, Uncle. I'll wait with you." The end.